India's forgotten history began in 1613 when the British East India Company first received permission to establish a trading factory on the Indian subcontinent. Nearly a century and a half later, the British foothold in India spread from the small trading post to the rest of the country. The British government implemented the martial race theory as a means of controlling what the British people saw as an inferior race. The martial race theory divided the Indian subjects into two distinctive categories: those that could fight and those that were more suited for administrative or civil duties. Those deemed martial came from the harsher climate of northern India, while those from the warmer, southern climate were generally thought of as weak. These arbitrary guidelines were used to draft over 650,000 Indian soldiers between August 1914 and November 1918 into the Indian Expeditionary Force, which was used as a part of the larger British military in the First World War. The Indian Expeditionary Force was divided into 7 different units ranging from A to G, which were divided across multiple continents. On September 30th, 1914, the Indian Corps Force A arrived on the Western Front and helped swing the momentum in favor of the Allied troops at the First Battle of Ypres. Historian George Morton Jack emphasizes the importance of the timely arrival of the Indians in his book, The Indian Army on the Western Front. He argues that without the Indians' entry into the First Battle of Ypres, the Germans might have overtaken the Allies. When the British front line broke, the men of Indian Force A fought the Germans to a bloody standstill.
In Sepoys in the Trenches, Major Corrigan tells a heroic story of Indian Force A in the First Battle of Ypres. 1,150 Indian soldiers paid with their lives, as opposed to only 40 British casualties, to retake a significant Allied foothold lost earlier in the day. This foothold would end up strengthening the Allied counteroffensive in the First Battle of Ypres, which resulted in an Allied victory that established the Western Front for the remainder of the war.
However, not all historians are as loving as Morton Jack and Corrigan. According to historian T.A. Heathcote, Indian forces were not employed to their full potential. Indian soldiers, though qualified, were not appointed as officers because of the British reluctance to have a colonial subject in charge of their men.
The Indian soldier is generally brave, nearly always loyal, but he is seldom, if ever, fit to replace the British officer, wrote Sir James Wilcox, commander of the Indian Corps in France. Immediately, you touch on this point. You strike the bedrock of the reason we own India. The Indian is simply not fit to lead his men against Europeans.
Ignorant and racist, this outlook not only hampered the Indian Division's ability to fight effectively, but also highlighted how fundamentally unethical the British military leadership was.
The 2nd Indian Cavalry Division was given bicycles to ride instead of their horses. Imagine riding a bike through a battlefield. It was impractical and demeaning. This decision to dismount the Indian Cavalry Division greatly impeded the Sepoys' combat effectiveness, truly revealing the complete and utter disregard for the Indian soldier.
Not only did the Indian forces face prejudice on the battlefield, but they were even discriminated against after paying the ultimate sacrifice. The layout of a British cemetery, the Grootbeat Cemetery, very clearly implies the Indians as inferior and separate. Centrally located are the graves of the fallen British soldiers. Tucked away in a corner are the Indian graves. To this day, the cemetery is beautifully maintained, but continues to implicitly show the gap between the Indian troops and British troops of the First World War. The Indians' role in World War I needs to be recognized, not only because of their significant contributions to the Allied effort despite racist British officers, but also because of their involvement forever changed the imperialistic relationship between the British Empire and India. This was, essentially, the beginning of the end for British rule on the Indian subcontinent. As the Indian sepoys were exposed to Western society and culture, they began to question their own role as subordinates to a nation thousands of miles away. In the face of such horror and atrocity, Indian nationalism towards the larger empire began to wane. Indians began to consider themselves as Indians rather than British subjects. No longer were Indian men ignorant of their emasculation at the hands of the British imperialists. Indians began to express a much more self-determined perspective of nationalism, as opposed to British imperial pride. Indian involvement in the First World War should not be forgotten. It should be remembered as a significant contribution that not only altered the course of the war, but also the course of British imperialism.